Oh boy, here we go. Hello, my name is Alvin Holloman. The purpose of uh, this video with the PowerPoint attachment is to sort of give a brief overview of public service in general. I'm going to be recording a series of videos with some PowerPoint slides. I may use some of these recordings in my classrooms. Some of them may be posted on Facebook for friends there. And my motivation for doing this is I think many of us are very frustrated with government, uh, primarily here in California at the state level. We're frustrated at the federal level, whether we're Democrats, Republicans, or independents. There's a lot that goes on in government that we don't really understand. I think, I understand a little bit of it, and I'll share what I do know. And probably explore some issues that merit more research, I guess, for lack of a better term, if you will. Uh, so before we get started, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, just kind of the basics on a professional side. I've got both a doctorate and a master's degree in management. My undergraduate degree was in business administration, a BA from CSU Fullerton. Early in my career, I was an auditor for the state of California Department of Corporations, and during that time, I passed the CPA exam and had the experience requirement met. So I am a CPA, but now technically a retired / inactive CPA. I haven't really done any accounting work for a number of years. After the auditing career, I spent a few years as a CFO with a large credit union. And then I went into local government, so nearly 3 years with Fresno County as the division chief of their audit division. I then had various finance director positions, redevelopment director, other department head positions, assistant city manager positions, and for a brief time, an interim city manager position in various cities throughout Southern California. So my experience base is largely, both finance and development in nature, including economic development. Since the 1999-2000 school year, I have been a lecturer with CSU San Bernardino. So about half of my career now has been spent doing that. Once I received my doctorate in 2010 from the University of Maryland system, I also taught full-time as an associate professor at 3 different private universities over about a 7 or 8 year period. But during that time, I also taught online for CSU San Bernardino. Since 2017, I've taught exclusively for CSU San Bernardino as a lecturer on a part-time basis, usually teaching anywhere from 4 to 7 classes per year. And sorry about that. And I enjoy it very much. While my degrees were in business and management, my professional experience is in public administration. And frankly, there's a lot of crossover between general private sector management and the public sector. My passion is public service, and that's the motivation behind doing this little series, if you will, on public service. And there's a lot of controversial things in play right now, especially with the new Trump administration. And so there's a lot of questions and confusion as to what's going on. And so I'm going to do my best to just shed some light on things. that I think I may understand and some things I don't. And so with that, we're going to start with the first part of this, and we're going to focus on U.S. federal aid, and in particular, the USAID office, which is getting a lot of controversy. So we're going to go to fancy little screen share here. Okay, pardon me while I get some water. Now, the United States distributes funds for foreign aid in a variety of ways. Um, the following are four primary intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs, that receive U.S. funds. The ones we're going to mostly focus on are the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization. We're mentioning the UN, but they have such a broad array of activities and services that aren't necessarily specific to the U.S. funding poverty, if you will, in other countries, or trying to help other countries out. UN does some of that, but the main ones are the World Bank, which is really the primary one, because their whole purpose is to uh, help developing nations and reduce poverty. Um, the IMF does that to a very limited extent, but their main focus is to provide monetary stabilization and take care of things such as an imbalance of inflows to outflows. In other words, if a country has more demands going out, be it debt payments or social security types of payments, if they have more of those than revenues coming in, the IMF can make short-term loans to help fund that hopefully temporary gap. The World Trade Organization regulates global trade. Supposedly, it's controversial. Well, actually, all of these organizations are controversial. The World Bank, in particular, is caught in a real conundrum. Um, they started after World War II, uh, as did the IMF and the WTO, which was formerly GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And the UN also started shortly after World War II. And the purpose of these IGOs was to help stabilize the global economies and alleviate significant imbalances relative to the earnings gap. And, poor countries just simply have not been able to develop at the rate of Western Europe and the United States, for instance. And so these organizations were essentially formed to provide more global stability. I guess that's a better way to put this. The United States is the largest funder of these organizations by far, usually 2 to 3 times that of the other large nations. So this is just to give you a little information on who heads up these organizations. The World Bank is an interesting one. Their CEO is now Ajay Banda from India. The World Bank's headquartered in Washington, D.C. But this merits some discussion. Traditionally, the president of the World Bank was always from the United States. The predecessor to Mr. Banja was David Milpas of the United States, but he ran afoul of the Biden administration over climate change mitigation funding. President Biden and his staff thought that the World Bank should be involved in funding climate change mitigation measures in developing countries, and Milpas adamantly disagreed. As a result of that, Biden orchestrated his termination, which was kind of unusual, and installed Mr. Bonda instead. The United States has a lot of influence on who heads up the World Bank. So this was a first to basically get rid of a United States resident in favor of someone from another country, and it was over a climate change mitigation dispute. Kristalina Georgieva heads up the IMF. She's from Bulgaria. That's also headquartered in Washington, D.C., excuse me, as is the World Bank. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from Nigeria is the head of the World Trade Organization. Excuse me. And the UN CEO is Philemon Yang from Cameroon, and the UN is headquartered in New York City. And I should note that the exact position titles of the above vary, but essentially they are CEOs. Some are called like a director general and things of that nature. There are also other IGOs, but these are the primary ones and certainly the largest ones. So the current controversy, let's talk about this. So the USAID office was established by executive order, and we're going to talk more about EOs in part 2 of this series, but they were established, it was established by an EO by JFK in 1961. And Congress authorizes USAID's programs in the Foreign Assistance Act, which Congress supplements through directions in annual funding, appropriation acts, and other legislation. As an official component of U.S. foreign aid policy, USAID operates subject to the guidance of, and this is very important, subject to the guidance of the President, Secretary of State, and the National Security Council. Okay, so once Congress, passes whatever funding legislation they pass, the administration of this office falls under the executive branch. Okay, it's not micromanaged by Congress, and that's a very important point as we look at what's going on now. This USAID office, while authorized by Congress, is not codified as a separate U.S. department, independent of the Department of State. It is a function or a division within the Department of State. So Marco Rubio now is the Secretary of State, so this office technically reports to him. And it becomes very murky as to what discretion presidents have in issuing EOs to alter U.S. aid activities or any other activities for that matter. And in part 2 of this series, we're going to talk about executive orders versus legislative actions. It's a big area. So on one hand, since this office was established by an EO, theoretically, it can be disbanded by an EO. But because of congressional approval of the office in the Forest Assistance Act and related approved appropriations since it began in 1961, a president such as Trump may not be able to disband the office or cut its funding unilaterally via an executive order. And again, technically, the office reports to the Secretary of State. So further complicating this, however, is, since the President of the U.S. serves as a chief personnel officer for the country, and in turn, for the USAID office, this is delegated to department heads such as Rubio. Conceivably, the president could direct funding cuts or staff terminations if fraudulent activity or misallocations of funds are evident. And this is where things get a little bit dicey, if you will. Trump, as you probably all know by now, established this unofficial Department of Government Efficiency. It's not an official federal department. It's really just an ad hoc advisory function to the president. And he had Elon Musk head this up with Vivek Ramaswamy. And their purpose was to audit federal expenditures, including USAID, and see if there is any waste or abuse. And we're going to discuss the legitimacy of Musk and EOS again more in part two. So, what I have learned so far from following the news on this is that a judge ruled that Musk and only two of associates could have access to expenditure records, and they're read only. So they're not able to make any software changes. They're not able to go and cut appropriations or budgeted amounts. All they can do is read the expenditure list. And there's been much ado about this, but really, those lists should be public information, as are all federal expenditures. They should be public information, but getting that information is very, 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 very difficult. And I'm going to give you an example and a challenge. In the Biden administration, excuse me, the Infrastructure Investment Act, basically there was an appropriation of $7 billion to install electric vehicle charging stations across the United States. I have tried endlessly in various federal government websites, you name it, doing Google searches. I have tried to find out exactly how many charging stations have been built, and I cannot find the answer. Anecdotally, I've heard on the news various people saying they've only built 3 and 2 of them don't work. And then I heard a number of 9, but that's all anecdotal. It's not factual. So I'd like to challenge you to find out that information. I hope you do. And if you do, let me know. But my guess is you're not going to be able to find it out. And I use that as an example just to illustrate how incredibly difficult it is to get information on the details of expenditures in the federal government. This is what Musk is doing. That's all he's doing. He's just going through lists, trying to see if there are areas that appear fishy or perhaps out of the norm in terms of what, in this case, the USAID office would normally fund. That's all that's going on. As being a California resident, I have tried to find out a lot of detailed information about what goes on with the California budget. I find some of it, and other things I just can't get an answer to it. So we're in a tough time here as far as public disclosure, and fair and adequate disclosure. The public is being blindsided, I think, in many respects. So, despite this current criticism of USAID, they've had a long history of success in funding poverty relief, combating health issues and disease such as AIDS, and many other areas, that are related to humanitarian assistance. But in recent years, the office has also engaged in funding many activities of a social engineering nature. These have ranged from condoms purchases for Hamas in the multi-millions to transgender surgeries in developing nations. And there's a whole laundry list of these things. They've been publicized. You can easily do a Google search on USAID controversy, and you can see the items for yourself. I didn't see a need to really put this in here. But this is what's created the controversy and actions by the Trump administration. And of course, this is uncharted territory, and we don't know what the end result will be. Surely there's going to be lawsuits, or there already are some, battles in Congress, exaggerations of facts on both sides, a lot of noise, a great deal of noise on this. And really, when you think about it, I would advocate not that big of a deal. I mean, all they're doing is looking at expenditure lists in US departments. They can't change anything. And Trump cannot undo appropriations unilaterally. Those are acts of Congress. But if there is misuse, again, misuse of funds or even perhaps fraud, a president may be able to do that or certainly hold up expenditures. I'm not an expert in that area. It's we're going to watch it unfold before us on the television news. And you know, the other thing is the situation will certainly open the door to more scrutiny of alleged misuse of funds across Washington D.C. and battles are going to go on. They will extend. And, you know, I hate to appear partisan here. I really, you know, want to keep everything objective. That's a role, one of the roles we play in public administration, you know, teaching and our professors, etc. Try to stay nonpartisan and focus on the facts and the issues. But there are some indisputable facts that do speak for themselves that speak to this issue very clearly. At the end of this part one, I'm going to give you various website links where you can see data for yourselves. So just don't take my word for it, please. 99% of all government employee union contributions go to Democrats. This is per opensecrets.org. I think I forgot to put that one in there at the end. It's a very important website. You can find out who funds what politicians, unions that fund certain politicians or groups. You can find out how much money, you know, your favorite elected official receives and so forth. It's a great website. But again, 99%, this is a fact, of all government employee union contributions go to Democrats. 66% of all government union members support Democrats. So there's a 33% gap between what union leadership funds and supports versus their member preferences. And this is another topic for another time, but you know, stating the obvious, there does appear to be an incestuous relationship between federal workers and the Democrat Party. So the so-called swamp, you know, as it's been referred to. And one could say, when we've seen what's been going on in the news, no wonder the Democrats in Congress are going crazy, trying to protect USAID workers and budgets. And so before we conclude part one of this series, we must talk about administrative overhead and cost allocation. Now, these are not sexy topics, but they're very complex. And because they're complex and the general public doesn't really have much of an appetite to dig in the nuts and bolts of these things, but, you know, this is how governments, IGOs, and NGOs get away with channeling funds away from direct services to benefit management, consultants, and cronies. So cost allocation. The federal government publishes guides and regulations for cost allocation related to all U.S. governments and nonprofits who receive federal funding in any form. It is a methodology for allocating overhead costs to the boots on the ground service delivery items, such as street repairs, libraries, etc. Furthermore, unfortunately, savvy governments, IGO, and NGO management often find ways to include consultant costs in these overhead costs, and these consultants can be well-connected cronies, and their costs can get allocated down to the direct service costs and functions. And so if you're trying to find out, you know, how much consultants are paid, you may have to go clear down to the direct service cost to find that out, but they're probably buried in there in an administrative overhead line item, and you might not be able to find that. So the next slide demonstrates how this works. Next two slides. In the following cost allocation example, the direct cost of street repairs is $1 million, but the final total cost is $1,220,000, 22% more due to cost allocation. The amount of cost allocation to each direct services category depends on how many categories there are. The more categories, the less cost allocation to each. The fewer categories, the more cost allocation to each. In effect, all administrative overhead needs to be allocated regardless of how much time is actually spent on each category in many cases. So the consultant in the following example may or may not have actually put $100,000 of effort into the street repairs project. It depends on oversight of his activities and how well connected he or she is to the powers that be in this instance. So pardon me while I grab a drink of water here. Okay, so we're going to talk about how much the street repairs are in city A or county A, whatever the case may be. So the administrative overhead, we begin with the general stuff like general management, be it a city manager or a county administrative officer, finance, including the finance director, information technology, HR, etc. Let's assume all of this costs $1 million. And they're going to allocate 10% of that to public works. In other words, they figured that, well, okay, 10% of our time is spent on public works. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's supposed to be time records that support this. Frankly, usually there are not. They're just estimates and assumptions. So this $100,000 finds its way down here into the public works general management category. Public works general management is $500,000. So when you take this 10% of above, which is 100K plus 500K equals $600,000 in public works to be allocated. So their allocation to street repairs is 20% in total. So the allocation amount is 20% of 600K, which is $120,000. So now we get down here in the street repairs direct costs. Let's, the staff to fix potholes and things of that nature. Perhaps they're using some outside contractors. That all comes to $1 million. When we add in 120,000 from admin, and they may have a consulting engineer theoretically on site, giving advice, supervising, and so forth. So the total street repairs costs are $1,220,000, or 22% more than the $1 million in direct costs. This is how we get the $3,000 hammers in the Department of Defense. It's because of cost allocation, and all of these costs up here that float down to the cost of a hammer. This is how it works. So here's where I'd like to give you some websites you can look at. The first four here are the World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, and UN. I forgot to put a couple of links in here. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop this now, and I'm going to verbally spell out a few more. There's a wonderful film called Poverty Incorporated. You can look it up on Tubi and find it. It's also on a few other websites. It demonstrates how NGOs really fund some very high-paid consultants and other activities that aren't really effective in alleviating poverty or hunger or whatever the case may be. It's well worth a watch. Um, you can also find various other government agencies that have good data by doing a search. Be it the California Department of Finance, the United States Department of Labor, uh, or whatever the case may be. And, with that, we're going to conclude part one. And when we get back to you next time, we're going to be talking about executive orders versus legislative actions. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.